Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink, I believe was actually provided by my mysterious benefactor. It seems like there's a trend going on this week. But, yeah, it's an ink that, admittedly, I never would have bought for myself, and now having tried it, I still wouldn't. But, yeah, it's MonteVerde Blue Black. It's gray. It's a very thin gray. This is one of those inks that, like, very, very literally infuriated me. Yeah. Okay, moving on. The pens I used were this Kaweco Ice with a double broad nib. It actually has Eternal Fox in it now, but it was in there at one point. And an Esterbrook SJ, so, you know, the littlest of their three pens. And it doesn't have the nib in it anymore, but it used to have a 9314 nib, which was a very, you know, because all their nibs have little numbers on them. That one's actually, the nib I used for this test was actually packed away because I had to clean it because I couldn't figure out what was going on with this test. Something about this pen or that nib's feed reacted very badly with this ink, and I constantly had to, you know, pull the lever to, like, prime the feed to get ink to come out, because it just would not come out. Anyways, let's check out the chromatography. As you can see, there's pretty much nothing in this ink. Yeah, you can't even see where the drop initially was. There's some weird purpley gray stuff, and then some bright blue up at the top. And dried, which is not how you're supposed to do it, there's no change whatsoever. So, some comparisons. Here's MonteVerde Blue Black up here. As you can see, it is gray, slightly blue, and very, very thin. Here's an actual gray, diamine graphite. See how much darker it is? That's lovely. This is not. Noodler's Lexington, which I love, has all kinds of wonderful properties. See how dark it is? No. 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 Ackerman, number 29. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Something gray. I'm sure I've offended your ears enough as it is. God, I hate this ink. I hate this ink so much. Yeah, it's extremely thin and watery. I hate it. Okay, top down in density. Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Yeah, look at that. It's hard to read. It's so thin. It's hard to read. It's infuriating. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna deep breath, gonna try and be reasonable about this. Yeah, the fine nib took 6 seconds, the double broad took 25. Now, I guess if there was something nice about ink being so watery, you get very extreme shading. So you can see how it can be very dark and very, very light. The problem is, it's so light that this fine nib is actually hard to read. For me, this is actually difficult to read. Luckily, the double broad puts down enough ink that it becomes dark enough to read, but I mean, that's difficult to read. So, yeah, I mean, there's no bleed, there's no feather, there's no spread. The flow was perfectly fine in the Kaweco, but something about the Esterbrook it just would not run out of it. When I tried it with another ink, that nib was perfectly fine, so something about this ink just didn't agree with it. Yeah, no sheen, none of that. It's so thin that even though it's technically a blue-black, there's no show-through, even though this is very dense paper, so it shouldn't be a problem anyway, but yeah. Now, the double broad puts down more ink, which means that there's more remaining when you try and wash it away. You can tell which lines in the grid, up and down, were with the double broad, and the across were with the fine, and they're completely gone. And here you can't even see where the fine writing used to be, and a lot of the double broad is washed away as well. Next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter, where even without, you know, the distracting lines of the Sayas paper, I mean, this is dot paper, even still, it's so light, it's almost hard to read. It's so thin. This ink is so thin. The fine took 3 seconds to dry, the double broad took 22. You still get very severe shading because of the wateriness of it. And yet even still you can see the dots through the darkest parts of it. So yeah, I was getting pretty infuriated. And I was sick of having to prime the pen. But yeah, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread. There's no echo, there's no sheen. In that regard, it's great. But okay, so the water test, you see how water was written with the double broad and test was written with the fine, and it is completely gone. That's not just a trick of the light, that's just gone. Pretty much the entire grid is gone except for the dots. Next is Tomoe River Paper, which, because of the way it sort of forces ink to dry, it usually accentuates shading. Here, I mean, look at how light that is. That's hard to read, especially in the fine. I mean, it got... And this was like freshly primed again, so this should have been like free-flowing and all good, and it wasn't. And even still, it took 11 seconds to dry. The double broad did take, I think it was about 32. It took more than 30 seconds to dry, but this paper is very hydrophobic. That was a double broad nib, and this is really watery ink, and since it resists water, I mean, I'm not shocked, but yeah. And I mean, this is gray. It's a vaguely blue gray. I mean, look, that's hard to read. But yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no sheen. There's, I mean, it's so thin that, I mean, there's the tiniest bit of like show through in the double broad, but that's about it. So there's that. But yeah, Tomoe River loves to let ink just slide away when you add water. And here it did that again. You can actually see the indentations on the paper from where I was writing, but you can't actually see the writing. But yeah, so it's gone. Yeah. So next up is terrible, terrible 20-pound copier paper, which, for the sake of fairness, I only use the Esterbrook, except to write the name. But yeah, it turned just like this weak gray. Yeah, it's. I mean, there's bleeding, there's feathering, there's spread. And this is a very dry writing, very fine nib. I mean, here you can see it, and that's even with the light coming from this direction. I mean, this is... I mean, it was so dry writing that I had to, like, prime the nib, and even still, this is the result that I was getting. It's not a pleasant color. It's not even like a nice dove gray. No, it's just... And it absolutely exploded, what little there still is. I mean, usually absorbent paper sucks the ink in, and it makes it hard to wash out. But even here, it washed out, and it's hideous. I can't read that, and I wrote it. I know what's there. Next is Mead Notebook Paper, where again, I only use the fine Esterbrook, except to write the name. And again, it's so light, it's hard to read. I mean, this light blue line is darker than the writing. It's, and it feathers a lot, like if you look at pale. Pretty bad. There's an extreme woolliness, and even though this is, again, a very dry nib, it came through. Here, where's the light? I'm trying to get it on the... You see that? It's like all through here. I mean, it's a mess, and you can tell where and since this was a dry writing nib and I had to keep priming it anyway, you can see where I had to prime it again. You see how this is a bit darker than this? The feed could not keep up with this paper. It was a big problem. That's essentially gone. I mean, you can kind of see a bit of what used to be there in the water test, but I mean, the dots are there. That's nice, but... And lastly is Moleskine Notebook Paper, where again, I only use the fine except to write the name. But again, it's just turned so light. It's physically hard to read. Here, there is some shading. I mean, like, you know, you can see there versus there, or the end of the S versus the top of the S, but... All it does is accentuate how thin and watery this ink is. It's not a complementary kind of shading. It took 4 seconds to dry. There's a lot of... It's a very intense woolliness. It leads into feathering, but again, because the ink is so light, it's actually kind of hard to see the feathers on camera. But yeah, it's... and it's utterly gone. I mean, that's just gone. You can see some of the dots. That's it. The water test was terrible. And even though this is an extremely dry writing, fine nib, look at all that bleed. I mean, what the heck? So, yeah, there you go. I like to think that I'm not an elitist when it comes to fountain pen inks. You know, I like cheap inks. MonteVerde is sort of one of the more economic level ink manufacturers. But this ink in particular I hated. However, there was another ink of theirs that I will be reviewing soon that I actually did enjoy. This one is terrible. I never want to use this ink again. I'm going to burn this vial. Ugh. Anyways, if you enjoy it, I'm sure you have your reasons. I'm sure it's great for you. I'm not sure an ink has ever infuriated me quite this much. But yeah, so for your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for listening to my ranting. Bye.